Greetings, dear friends. You're watching Ruslan Bailov, and this is the daily combat operations briefing from the Ukrainian front. We're starting today, unexpectedly, with the Orikov direction. Let's take it from south to north. As I reported in today's first briefing, footage emerged showing strikes by Ukrainian forces on Russian troops in the southern outskirts of the town of Orikov. That advance is now confirmed and marked on the map. There hadn't been much news from this direction for a while. It seems that after gaining partial control over AFU logistics in Orikov, Ukrainian forces were caught off guard and missed a Russian strike, and Russian army units suddenly found themselves inside the town, taking full control of the settlement of Novodanilovka. Also today, pro-Russian OSINT sources report that the Russian army has made fairly significant progress on the western outskirts of Orikov, with the advance toward the town proceeding along a broad front. It's possible we'll soon see an entry into the town from this direction as well, though, as I've said, that still seems somewhat unlikely for now. It's quite possible that Ukrainian defenses in the town have begun to weaken, since the town is being hit by a large number of glide bomb strikes almost daily. On that note, pro-Ukrainian sources reported today that over the past month the Russian army used a record number of glide bombs. More than 8,000 units, meaning nearly 300 guided bombs, are being dropped on Ukrainian positions every day. Some drone operators are undoubtedly being lost to strikes of this scale, and I think psychology plays a major role here too, since most operators are based in high-rise apartment buildings, and targeted strikes on those buildings don't exactly let them work in a relaxed state of mind. In addition, Russian intelligence is also constantly searching for and locating operators. The battle for Orikov is only in its very earliest phase, and 80% of its success will depend on whether the Russian army can gain control of the logistics. Clearing the settlement itself is also no simple task, but it's entirely achievable. The capture of Orikov would change the state of a front line that has, roughly speaking, remained static since the start of the war. And of course, it would pose a direct threat to Zaporizhzhia. So we may soon see some very interesting developments on this axis if the Ukrainian army misses this blow and fails to respond in time. Given that a similar situation exists not only here, but on other directions as well, AFU command will most likely choose the direction that's least painful from a domestic political standpoint. From experience, I've noticed that when they sense they're about to lose something, they try to sacrifice whatever matters least, prioritizing the loss of what would be least painful. But this obviously can't go on forever. Sooner or later, they'll have to choose between cities like Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, the northern Kharkiv region, Zaporizhzhia, and Dobropilya. Losing any of these cities would be painful for Ukraine, but we'll see how events unfold and in what order they come under Russian army control. Of all of these, Zaporizhzhia is by far the hardest. It's genuinely the most painful for Ukraine and could have a major impact on the conflict as a whole, whereas losing the other cities, even combined, wouldn't affect the overall course of the conflict nearly as much. There's no news today from the eastern flank of Zaporizhzhia. I expect Russian advances there in the near future. After taking Lyubitskoye, there's no reason for the Russian army to stop. The breakthrough needs to be expanded both south and north. On Dobropilya, today we're seeing glide bomb strikes as the Russian army prepares the ground for what looks like a major push into the town itself, likely from both the south and the east simultaneously. If that succeeds soon, the town's fate could be decided very quickly. Footage shows brutal strikes on high-rise buildings, some of which are simply being leveled. Over the past few days, the front in this direction has come sharply back to life, whereas earlier, after the fall of Pokrovsk, things had been frozen here for a long time. Ukrainian forces have repeatedly tried to retake ground here, even landing by helicopter at one point, if you recall. That ended very badly for their special forces. Now, let's move to other directions, over to Constantinovka. You know, this whole AFU broke through in Constantinovka business. That's not just hype, that's literally what Ukrainian news outlets are reporting. According to Russian sources, Russian positions are improving northwest of Constantinovka, south of Orikhiv. Orikhiv, by the way, isn't under solid Russian control yet, only about 50%. But Alexeyevo-Druzhkovka is right up against Orikhiv, and there's footage of Russian troops in that settlement, which itself borders directly on Druzhkovka. As for Mykolaipilia, We haven't yet received objective control footage from there, but I think some information should come out of there soon, since the settlement sits between Torska and Konstantinovka itself, and over recent days, the Russian army has been pressing on that settlement's logistics from the north. Essentially, there's no reliable supply route left for ammunition or food into that settlement. You could say Ukrainian forces there are caught in a pincer, and that pincer is going to keep tightening. I think within the next couple of days, we'll get word that this settlement has come under full Russian army control. Fighting is most likely already underway there. The most interesting part is that AFU blogger Muchnoy, who apparently has a presence on literally every front sector, practically immortal like Duncan MacLeod, talks about the Kramatorsk direction, the Sloviansk direction, the Orikov direction, the Huliai-Pol direction. But there's no Konstantinovka direction anymore. He's got a Druzhkovka direction instead. And in that Druzhkovka direction, he's essentially saying the same thing I am, that individual reconnaissance sabotage groups are already being spotted in Alexeyevo-Druzhkovka. Yet according to Ukrainian media, and especially the deep state map, they seem to have slipped up a bit. An area that was grey zone just the day before yesterday has now been coloured in as if Ukrainian forces advanced toward the centre. Specifically, that they've taken positions northwest of the centre of Konstantinovka, and dense ones at that, a solid seizure. Meanwhile, they still mark roughly half of Konstantinovka as grey zone. Russian forces, according to their account, are still fighting somewhere around Ilyinovka, Berostok, and Ivanopilia. So if you believe that map, Ukrainian forces are apparently still holding Ivanopilia, which is already 20 kilometers from the front line. They seem to be living in quite an interesting world, even though we've received objective control footage from the northern part of Konstantinovka multiple times, which apparently counts as weak evidence for Ukrainian OSINT analysts. It's possible they're simply afraid of being sent to the front line and are therefore just not acknowledging what's happened to Konstantinovka. At least that's what happened before, when they were threatened with being sent to the front and suddenly started drawing the maps the way they were supposed to, quite professionally, to everyone's surprise. Now politics has gotten involved again, and the quality of the Ukrainian deep state resource has suffered as a result. From the Kramatorsk direction, we're getting a large amount of footage of strikes on Ukrainian forces in the city itself. You've probably noticed that over the past couple of weeks, Kramatorsk has been hit by an enormous number of strikes daily. The city itself has essentially become a frontline city. Living there is no longer really possible. Sloviansk too. The front is just now approaching these two cities, and you can still see there are civilians left in them, not many, but some. The fate of these cities is most likely a grim one. Once the front line passes through a city, once the fighting ends, there's usually little left of the infrastructure or the housing. Although looking at Konstantinovka, it doesn't seem nearly as destroyed as, say, Bakhmut was, where fighting raged inside buildings for months on end. And it's not hard to imagine what happens to a house when you're in one and your opponent is in the one next door, and you need to take that house. I'm honestly surprised by some people's reactions when they see cities destroyed like this. A lot of people don't understand at all that war isn't some American movie. In real life, it's brutal. All right, moving on. Let's head north to that hotly watched stretch of front where the Russian army is launching converging strikes toward each other in order to finally close off this pocket. This cauldron, call it whatever you like, this little sack. The advance here isn't happening along the shortest stretch of front, so the distance, which stood at 14 kilometers 400 meters, remains unchanged. But there has been an actual advance, I'd estimate around 700 meters, with the capture of Bakshivka, which was also reported taken this morning and is now marked accordingly on the map. Ukraine has lost one more settlement. Ukraine has gotten smaller by one settlement. From here we move to the Sumy direction, over to the Shostka district, at the very northern tip of the line of contact, where there's a microscopic but nonetheless real advance. There aren't even any real settlements here. A buffer zone is continuing to form in this area. Right now it has a kind of crescent shape, which isn't quite accurate. I think very soon it's going to take on a different shape, sort of like an embryo, if you will. In short, pressure from Russian forces is being observed in this area, and generally speaking, the northern border region of Ukraine. This year in particular, the northern grouping of Russian forces is showing territorial gains, whichever way you look at it. Now let's talk about an important development on the technological front. Russia's new Seeker jet-powered drones continue to strike a massive number of targets. One such target category is fuel depots in the north. Several were destroyed again today. It seems they've managed to get reasonably good communications sorted out, since we're now getting strike footage from them almost daily. This drone has one unique advantage that most drones in this war lack: its speed. All Ukrainian drone interceptors fly at around 350 km/h and always approach from behind, meaning they're effectively chasing the Russian drone rather than flying to meet it head-on. They first detect it, fall in behind it, and once the drone has passed nearby, they launch several interceptors. The one problem with this particular drone is that it's very hard to catch up to. Arguably impossible, given the enormous speed difference. It's also not easy to bring down with standard interceptor groups, since it passes them very quickly, leaving only a few seconds to hit it. I don't know what kind of communications link it currently has, but if it ends up with satellite connectivity like Starlink, that would be a major leap forward for the Russian army, since I imagine Russian command is very eager to strike deep into Ukraine's rear. With drones like this, it becomes possible to essentially cut Ukraine off along the Dnieper River. These drones can comfortably strike 200 out of 300 km deep into enemy territory. They're not as long-range as the standard Geran drones, since they burn through fuel much faster and can therefore cover somewhat less distance. Devastating strikes hit Dnipropetrovsk, destroying major warehouses belonging to Ukrainian everyday goods, chocolate and ice cream producers. Among them was a warehouse holding Millennium chocolate products. Because of the large loss of finished goods, Ukraine is expected to face supply disruptions in the near future. A fire also completely destroyed the stock of popular Ukrainian ice cream maker Lasunka, which had been stored at one of the warehouses. Also destroyed was a large warehouse belonging to consumer goods producer Biosfera, which stored products from the brands Freckenbock, Smile, PRO Service, Novita, Vortex, Eventa, and Lakit. Zelensky's underwhelming 40-day forcing of Russia to peace, the operation for whose sake he raised the escalation level back in late June, is now wrapping up. Its outcome is being punctuated by yet another massive missile strike on Kyiv. These are now happening on an almost weekly basis. Though in this case, Ukraine is merely the executor. The decision to escalate in order to force Moscow into a frozen conflict was made in Washington, and not even this summer, but last year. That's precisely what the Anchorage talks were staged for as cover. Buying the Ukrainian side time to prepare long-range strikes on Russian territory. Did the opposing side manage to achieve anything? Yes, to some extent, Crimea and the new regions, which they tried to isolate through mid-range strikes, faced serious problems. Fuel shortages appeared across the country, and logistics hubs took damage. This was unpleasant and caused real harm, but it came nowhere close to creating a critical threat to the functioning of Russia's economy and social sphere. So how did Russia respond? First, a full-scale naval blockade of Ukraine began. No vessel can now enter the ports of Greater Odessa, creating extreme risks for Ukrainian exports, above all its core agricultural and metallurgical products. Second, the number of strikes on Ukrainian oil storage facilities and fuel stations rose sharply. As a result, a fuel crisis is now beginning inside Ukraine itself. Third, that same response targeting logistics hubs was fired back in the opposite direction. And this is all before the next large-scale campaign to destroy power infrastructure has even begun. That one is apparently slated to start in late autumn. It's fair to say that forcing Russia to peace did not happen. On the contrary, in this infrastructure war, Moscow is clearly starting to gain the upper hand over Kyiv, which was fairly predictable since its capabilities are far greater and had only been held back for political reasons. Perhaps this is precisely the moment when the decision was made to stop holding back. Though, as winter approaches, third countries will likely start calling on Russia to show restraint. The only question is whether it will feel like listening this time. Talks on the Strait of Hormuz have hit a deadlock. WSJ. The positions of Iran and of the US and its allies in the Persian Gulf remain diametrically opposed. Tehran is demanding security guarantees against new attacks first, an end to the US naval blockade, the lifting of sanctions on the oil sector, and the right to charge fees for vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Washington and the Arab monarchies, by contrast, are insisting that the strait be reopened first, with the question of sanctions to be discussed only after Tehran meets the relevant conditions. So far, neither side is showing willingness to make key concessions. Given this dynamic, it raises the risk of a prolonged standoff, as each side tries to secure favorable terms for itself before any further agreements are reached. An additional factor is the financial dimension of the conflict. The U.S. Congress had previously refused to allocate $88 billion to the Trump administration for a military operation against Iran, which significantly limits Washington's ability to sustain a large-scale campaign.